much appreciate the opportunity to take part in this discussion. And although I have ethics in my the title of my chair, I'm not really going to look at this from the perspective of ethics so much as from other aspects of public policy and how we might consider public policy, both as Catholics but also as economists. But I'm going to start with a quotation from A.J.P. Taylor, who said in his Oxford History of England, "Until August 1914, a sensible, law-abiding Englishman could pass through life and hardly notice the existence of the state beyond the post office and the policeman. He could travel abroad or leave his country forever without a passport or any sort of official permission. He could exchange his money without restriction or limit. He could buy goods from any country in the world on the same terms as he bought goods at home. For that matter, a foreigner could spend his life in this country without permit and without informing the police. All this was changed by the impact of the Great War. The state established a hold over its citizens, which, though relaxed in peacetime, was never to be removed, and which the Second World War was again to increase. The history of the English people and the English state merged for the first time." Now, I'm going to refer back to that quotation right at the end, but I think it's an interesting place to start because world wars have not been the only crisis where there has been an increase in interventions by the state, a little bit of rolling back, but a sort of ratchet effect whereby the state gradually becomes more and more involved in our economic and social lives. Now, if we start thinking about the, to move from principle to pragmatism for a moment, and then I'll come back to this at the end. If you start thinking about the problems of COVID-19 and public health policy from the perspective of an economist, you end up in roughly the same place as that to which the standard accounting Catholic social teaching would take you. The language and thought process are different, but many of the conclusions are the same. So let's start with the economics. The classic public health case for intervention arises from the fact that the benefits of public health interventions are, in the economic jargon, non-excludable and not diminished in consumption. You therefore can't easily charge for those benefits. So if I have a vaccination for an infectious disease, this just doesn't benefit me, but it benefits large numbers of other people as well. And that benefit arises from the reduced likelihood of everybody catching the disease as a result of my having the vaccination. So given this, especially in very serious circumstances, we might want to use policy measures to encourage actions that have public health benefits. And this is what public health was always supposed to be about. And the movement of Public Health England into almost every other area of our lives, including things like obesity, etc., and away from its prime duty of trying to promote public health, such as prevent communicable diseases and this type of thing, I think has meant actually that it's totally lost its focus. And that's been a tragedy when it has come to fighting this pandemic. So given this benefit from things like vaccination programs, the state often tries to bring about the behavior, promote the behavior that brings about the benefits. And in a free society, this would normally involve taxing the population to provide some kind of intervention for free to the population as a whole. So, for example, taxing the population as a whole in order to provide for a free vaccination program. Now, an out-and-out libertarian might object to that on the grounds that, as an out-and-out libertarian might put it, taxation is theft. But most economists would broadly, even those who broadly support a market economy, would support those kinds of interventions. So public finance, for example, of vaccination programs would normally be regarded as justifiable for all but the most ardent libertarians. And those types of interventions, in fact, don't cost very much, and they tend not to be all that controversial. Now, and other traditional approaches to public health problems involve things like information campaigns also not especially, public information campaigns, also not especially expensive and not especially intrusive. Now, if you approach this problem from the perspective of Catholic social teaching, as I mentioned, you end up in roughly the same position. So Catholic social teaching would tend to argue that families have a responsibility for making choices in relation to health and healthcare, as they do in relation to things like education. Other institutions in society help them and support them in making those choices and in taking actions in relation to health, healthcare, education, etc. However, if for some reason the common good of society as a whole is under threat, then the government might intervene. In the same way as it might intervene by raising an army, or indeed even conscription during wartime when society was under attack from outside. So normally we allow families, or ought to allow families, the maximum amount of freedom, but sometimes, only rarely, or ought to be only rarely, we will have to suppress that freedom for the greater good and for the protection of society as a whole, and for the protection of the common good. Now, the one intervention I've mentioned so far, a free vaccination program, public information campaigns as well, and other similar things, are not especially controversial. And I think if there were a COVID vaccine, I think there would be pretty widespread public cooperation with a vaccination program. But just as sometimes we have to put people's lives at risk or even conscript people into armies at war times, during wartime, Catholic social teaching would sometimes allow for even quite draconian measures if survival of society were at stake in other ways. So this might include the isolation for people with infectious diseases. So over the centuries, right up until the 1960s in the UK, we isolated people normally on a compulsory basis if they had some kind of infectious disease. And the church never spoke out against such things. It was regarded as necessary for the promotion and protection of the common good. And most economists, again, who broadly believe in free markets, would accept those types of interventions as an exception in exceptional circumstances. So this takes us to track and trace. Now, so in principle, given that argument, I don't have a great problem with track and trace. Despite being a strong supporter of a free economy and a great skeptic of government intervention, in a dire emergency, I think the current situation is a dire emergency, policies which would normally not be regarded as justifiable can be justified. But I would want certain safeguards. And in particular, I think people ought to be able to opt out of the activities to which track and trace applies, if that's possible and feasible. For example, I think a track and trace system which requires your data to be collected when you go to the pub or you go to a restaurant is different from a track and trace system which monitors your movements wherever you are in the country at any time. Secondly, I think the data should be destroyed after a short period of time. And thirdly, the scheme quite clearly should cease as soon as the emergency is over. It should cease at the soonest possible moment. And of course, this was the point that AGP Taylor mentioned, that you have these emergency interventions in wartime and then they stick around when the emergency has finished. However, having said that, in principle, I wouldn't be against such a scheme, I think in practice, these schemes are basically useless in a large free society. They might work in a highly regimented society or in a small country. But amongst many reasons why government intervention doesn't work is that governments overestimate their ability to centrally plan economic and social activity. And this applies to things like track and trace just as much as it applies to the economy in general. And there are two particular problems that governments face. The first is that they can't easily make trade-offs because people have different preferences. So in the case of COVID-19, the most obvious problem is that people have different preferences for risk. And in fact, they face different risks as well, depending on how heavy they are, how old they are, whether they're from different ethnic backgrounds as well. And our government, instead of trying to manage this, perhaps having different policy approaches for different segments of the population, because governments are simply not very good at managing trade-offs, has simply tried to assume away those trade-offs And its single policy objective seems to have been to stop hospitals from being full at the peak of the pandemic. And this has been achieved at great cost, including costs in terms of deaths by discharging people from hospitals into care homes. So governments are not very good at doing complex things which involve trade-offs in general. Secondly, the second problem that governments face is that human beings form what might be called a complex system, and complex systems can't easily be managed by central planning. So in complex systems, the reactions in terms of changes in behavior to a change in a set of circumstances can't easily be predicted. And that's the problem that we face when trying to track people's movements. So as Adam Smith put it in the theory of moral sentiments, the man of system is apt to be very wise in his own conceit, and is often so enamored with the supposed beauty of his own ideal plan of government that he cannot suffer the smallest deviation from any part of it. He seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. He doesn't consider that in the great chessboard of human society, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislature might choose to impress upon it. And you see this in the daily press conferences that the government has and the updates it's had since then. They are trying to do simple things and have simple messages, and they simply can't cope with, because it's beyond the capacity of government to deal with more complex reactions to the problem. So it is possible for the government to force everybody. Certainly wouldn't approve of this policy, but it is possible for the government to force everybody to have a vaccine with probably pretty much 100% compliance. It is possible for the government to subsidize a vaccine to provide it to everybody for free. The government can close down all economic activity, as happened in March, more or less. The government can, although this gets a bit more difficult, require people who have symptoms to isolate. But in the case of COVID, that's practically difficult because the symptoms are so generic. But I would have predicted a priori that running a track and trace system would be a very different ballgame. And I think it's, for obvious reasons, track and trace is proving very difficult. With track and trace, you are by nature tracking people who are on the move. And so it's complex in the first place to identify people and test them, but it becomes even more difficult to run a track and trace system when you factor in the impossibility of tracking down all the people who've been in contact with an individual who's showing symptoms, and bearing in mind all the movements that they might have had in the intervening period. To do this with any degree of success, I think you either have to have a very conformist society, such as South Korea, where track and trace seems to have had some success, or it might work in some local areas where you have a very decentralized approach to the problem, as they have had in Germany. But the UK has a very free society. We're culturally and socially very free, and we have a highly centralized approach to providing healthcare, even to the point of rejecting all functioning technology for track and trace, except in favor of our own bespoke NHS designed technology. And I think the whole system is just doomed to failure. But that is largely a practical problem rather than a problem in principle. So I would say that I have no qualms in general about giving my data to government or to agencies on behalf of government in situations of dire emergency. And in fact, I'm not particularly worried that the government would do anything malign with that data. I don't think it would have the competence to do so. So I think there are some circumstances in which the government could legitimately demand my data in a track and trace system, but we should never go beyond what is strictly necessary for the purpose. But in practice, I just don't think it's likely to be an effective response to the COVID problem in a large and culturally free and diverse society such as the UK. But to return to the AGP Taylor quotation, the problem is that every crisis leads to a further restriction of liberties. And those on the left who are less concerned about economic liberty than I might be, might just bear in mind how George Bush responded to the 9/11 crisis in the United States by restriction, not just of economic liberties, but a whole range of civil liberties as well. And we tend to find that when those crises lead to a restriction of liberties on the grounds that they are justified in particular circumstances, that those restrictions on liberties are never fully rolled back. So I do think that we should have an extremely high hurdle for any interventions, any restriction on our liberties that we have in a crisis such as this, and we should design those restrictions on our liberties in such a way that they are withdrawn immediately the crisis has come to an end.